All right, thank you. So when we talk about the future of mental health in a post-pandemic world, what we're really kind of looking at is a ministry or a model that has to be simple, that it is in real time, it has proven results, and that it's accessible now. It's really important because in today's age, when you look at how many of you are wearing a smartwatch? Okay, you can get a simple, evidence-based, real-time readout of your heart rate, your resting heart rate. You can actually do apps and where you can calm yourself down from anxiety and different things. It's simple, it's real-time, and it's evidence-based, and we can do it now. And in the church specifically, and for this challenge, this is what we need in the church, and we need to look at not only prevention and intervention, but how do we do prevention and intervention in such a way that we are actually doing reinvention, to reinvent lives in such a way that they transform, and such a way that we can develop these models that are simple, real-time, they have proven results, they're evidence-based, and they're accessible now. So what I mean by this is a story of John. Now, that's not his real name, and he's given me permission to share his story. But John, I met John at a Celebrate Recovery. A local pastor asked me to come to a Celebrate Recovery. Anybody familiar with Celebrate Recovery programs? A lot of people with addiction or various challenges end up and go to these groups. So a local pastor asked me to come and share a little bit at the pre-meeting, and then everybody broke up, and then I went into a group meeting with the men. Now, John was in this meeting with these men. I can tell that the men were kind of putting up with John. John really was out of place. He didn't fit. And so much anxiety that you could see, and even when I made a comment in the group, he snapped back at me and said, "Why'd you say that? Why'd you say that? What's wrong with you? Why'd you say that?" And of course, I responded calm, and we worked it out and things like that. Now, John has a mental health condition that leaves him from head to toe with constant fear, constant anxiety coursing through every part of his brain, every part of his body, so much so that it creates voices, it creates hallucinations, it creates delusional experiences that to you and me aren't real, but to him, it is real. It is part of his everyday life. And so he filters everything from God to community to his relationships through this paradigm that really doesn't seem to exist to you and me. For him, it does. So John was curious. So he came over and he started coming to our group, which is we call it Living Grace. And it's a group for mental health conditions where we integrate science and scripture and this concept of what does Jesus look like in the mental health journey rather than how we use mental health to get to Jesus. It's a integrated reality. So he was curious, so he started coming to our group. And then I also have a mental health recovery coaching program that we developed. I don't do it anymore because it actually got so big that we had to actually turn the coaching curriculum into a self-guided workbook, and we produced it, and now everybody's turning it into groups, and we're currently revising it. However, at that time, John wanted to visit, but John didn't want to be coached. He wanted to test me. Because John, now in his late 40s, early 50s, he is well-versed in the Bible. He knows the Bible. He knows church. But at one of our first meetings, he looks straight at me and he says, "I just want to see if you're going to reject me just like every other pastor has. And that's what I want to know." And I said, "Well, just keep coming and then we'll see when that day comes." So John kept coming to the group. And we had occasional meetings, and sometimes in the meetings, he was testing me because I represent the church world. I represent all the hurt and all the damage that he's been given because his question is, well, how come the gospel is not working to change my life, and it's actually making me worse? Which that's the question I'm asking. Yeah, why is that? How can we reinvent ways so that the gospel actually does work and helps you thrive in life? So John, even at times, he'd say, "Yeah, you're a little too much. I don't like you, but the grace that you give that's what I like." I'm like, "Okay, well, I'll continue to work on my self-actualization and, try to keep getting better so I can transcend for those professionals." However, John continues to the group, and he starts to grow. To the point where in the group we called him our resident theologian, because it was his job to read the scripture every group meeting, and he knew the Bible, so he would quote things and this and that, and so he had a real place within the community. And then he just continued to grow in our times. And one time I came to the group to facilitate the group, and there were over 20 people. Our little small group of 5 to 6 people was now over 20 plus people in the room. And I'm thinking, where did all these people come from? And they came from John, because John's only contact with the outside world was all the other support groups in town. That was his only world that he could live in, was in the other support groups. He had no other way to relate his faith. He said, I won't go to church. It's too triggering. I can't go there. It's too much. And they said, well, why don't you just sit in the back? No, that's still too much. I can't go. And he would say, well, this group is my church. This is where I can experience God and community. But now I have 20 plus people in this group, and I'm thinking, where all they come from? And they all came because of John. John had emptied out all the other support groups to come to this group because they were curious, what's going on with John? In one of these groups, a gentleman at the end pulled me aside, and he said, Joe, I know John. John is a very difficult person. He is a very challenging person to be around. And I've actually been hospitalized with John, but they put John in the back, which we call the glass room. They slam him with medications, and they put him in the glass room because he is very difficult, and he can be very challenging to handle. He's not pleasant to be around. And then he says, but ever since he's been coming to this group, he is a changed man. He is night and day different. There is something different about John. When he's been coming to this group, whatever he has, I want it, and that's why I'm here. And I said, well, come back next week. Simple. We're using evidence-based tools, evidence-based principle, psychology, neuroscience, all these tools within Scripture, combining in an integrated way so that we can transform lives, relationships, and community. And I have other stories that go way beyond John that'll make your jaw drop. And what people would say, that's a clinical miracle. And I would just say, this is just how love and transformation works. And we can do this in the church. Because I've seen all the research. I'm a research nerd. I will read all the articles. I listen to all these. I'm a nerd when it comes to, like, Dr. Hughes. I will listen to the 4 hours of talks and things like that. I sit and listen to all these things so that I can learn and figure out what is the story, what's the new narrative of how we reinvent how we do mental health, especially in the church. Because when you look at the research with the church and mental health, it's not very encouraging. But for us, I don't see negativity, I see opportunity. So, what does that look like in the church? So what I want to do in our time here is help you understand what is the spiritual mental health language and the landscape within the church. How do we look at the psychology? How do we look at the numbers and the statistics? And how does that translate within the church? Because in the church, and the everyday churchgoer, they don't speak psychopathology language. They don't speak statistics. They speak a spiritual language where all of this gets translated. I'm going to show you how that works from a theological standpoint. Very simply, trust me, I'm not going to go into we're not going to get into synchronic and diachronic and all these kinds of things of theology. We're just going to show you the simple ways of how this is translated. And then what is the innovative church solution, that things that others are doing, what we're doing, that really work today, that is simple, it's real-time, evidence-based. Okay, so the first thing is when we look at the statistics, just in general, pre-pandemic, we look at numbers like 1 in 5. 1 in 5 in the population are dealing on a yearly basis, dealing with a mental health challenge. Everybody knows this statistic, right? Everybody in this room, all right? Everybody knows this. Okay, but the thing is about these statistics, and this is, again, I work in seminaries and workshops and church leaders that I help them understand this, is that within this demographic, and of that 1 in 5, that 20 to 25% of that is what's called serious mental illness. That's where we get into schizophrenia or bipolar. It's a serious impairment of life function and reality. Like John, he lived on disability. That was his world. He couldn't hold down a job because of his condition. But that changed over time, and he actually got employed. But then the other major category of this is that 75 to 80% of this 1 in 5 is dealing with depression and anxiety-related challenges. It's probably impairing their lives such a way that they need treatment and they need support. And this could also be schizophrenia, but a high functioning, and they can be part of regular life and things like this. However, when we look at these numbers and just in the general statistic and understanding, if you just say 1 in 5, then for a pastor, he says, well, we don't deal with that. And they tell me, we don't deal with mental health. I remember talking to a pastor because this congregant was saying, go talk to Joe, we need mental health. And the pastor honestly literally told me, we don't have mental health challenges in our church. We don't have mental illness. Because for that pastor, he's thinking, we don't see schizophrenia in our church. He doesn't understand the breadth of the challenge. Okay, so now the pandemic, all right? So the pandemic, that 1 in 5, according to statistics, that 1 in 5 jumped up to 1 in 3. Now, of course, Dr. Hughes gave us all great resources and numbers, and you can go look at this stuff. However, what was happening is that during this time, the pandemic, we entered in what's called a collective trauma. Unprecedented loss from, my daughter was a senior during COVID, so she lost her prom, she lost all those events, and it really knocked out the feet from under her of, well, why would I want to go to college and sit in a Zoom class like what one of these students said? So it really was a toll, but for a lot of people, and everybody was experiencing, I mean, everybody, how many of you, when you went to the store, your first aisle was the toilet paper aisle, right? That scarcity will cause a lot of anxiety. So if you don't have a toilet paper, and then fortunately, I had a neighbor who worked at CBHC, and she said, I'll get you a roll of toilet paper. I'm like, yes. But again, we saw anxiety, depression, and this grief process really take place for a lot of people, and especially, obviously, not just a general population, but obviously the general population of the church as well. So we saw up to numbers of 30% of the population suffering from mental health challenges. That's a lot. You go 1 in 5 to 1 in 3. So again, pre-pandemic, we were at kind of 20% of the population, and that during the pandemic, that jumped up to 1 in 3, 30% of the population. Just think about that. So as a church, as a church leader, when you look at, oh, wow, we're just looking at these few tables over here, but now we're looking at these tables now too. We're looking at a significant increase. And again, it's a large part of that is that depression, anxiety. Now, when we now look at the post-pandemic, and we look at what is the post-pandemic and what are the statistics telling us from the mental health challenges. So the first one is that these are reports from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and they have a report on one page, and at the very bottom, they kind of give you some suggestions of what we might look at in the future, okay? One thing is that they said by up to 2029, we're probably going to see, studies suggest, okay, let me just say that, studies suggest we will see an increase in substance abuse and suicide. Now, I'm totally relieved that Dr. Hughes explained that we saw a dip during this last year or so, or 2021. However, what the study suggests, after an outbreak and after these challenges, we might see these challenges. Substance abuse obviously rose up to an increase of 25% even more through the pandemic, and we're still seeing these challenges with a lot of individuals because how do we cope? When you have a bunch of people who don't know how to deal with challenges and a longevity of challenge, not just an event, but we're talking about longevity, how do you cope and become resilient through that whole journey, okay? But here's what's really striking, that when you look at, and Dr. Hughes referred to, sorry, I keep referring to you because she's the expert, but one of the things that really is striking is that after a traumatic event or an outbreak or a disaster or things like that, yes, we do see a large part of the population that are very resilient, but there is a certain percentage of the population that will struggle with resilience and will have mental health challenges. So what the research suggests is that post-pandemic, the psychological toll from a traumatic event can last up to 3 years after the event. So, church leader, in your congregation, what we're looking at is a future landscape is that by 2024, 2025, even up to 2029, we have an opportunity to transform lives. We have an opportunity to do something that is impactful today, right now, and it can be very easy. All right? So I'm going to skip this one so I can get to this. In the church, okay? Now this is where it gets really confusing. I'm going to hopefully help you understand how this is translated within the church. Now, when it comes to mental health in the church, in the educational theology and the seminary trained and pastors and church leaders, rector, priests, et cetera, we don't talk about mental health as a psychopathology or science. We might have some small understanding, but it is usually talked through as what's called ontological theology. What does it mean to be human with a soul? And how does that soul interact with the Spirit of God and integrated with that reality? And how does sin play into that narrative, not only for the individual, the family, and society? So then that gets into a little anthropology as well. But it's all a theological process from understanding the Hebrew, the biblical language from Old Testament to New Testament, and understanding that reality. So when someone comes to the church asking for help, this is why the pastor does a spiritual diagnostic of understanding is there a sin problem, is there a devotion problem, or is there a quote-unquote spiritual warfare problem in your life? Because this is the framework of how it's understood. Secondary is psychopathology. But what's happening a lot of times and why pastors and church leaders are frustrated is because they're getting the science world kind of trying to push out all this ontological theology to replace it with just science. But what I'm trying to do with church leaders is help them come back into the conversation and let's learn together the integration of science and spirituality, because we're looking at the wholeness of life, not just this or that. How do we integrate that really well? And those are the conversations I love to have, because I look at all this neuroscience, I look at psychological studies, and I see a beautiful picture of the human design of what God has created and how it all works together. All we try to do is just put it into the material so that you can learn and grow and see transformation. Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we having conversations or conferences like this where we have theologians and we have the scientists coming together and working on the language together? How do we do that? Where are those meetings? I'm having those meetings, but they're usually in the back room. And I'm usually working with senior pastors who are like, it's okay. You're not in trouble. Okay, then the second thing is also, from a theological standpoint, is theodicy. What is suffering, and how does that work out with a good God? These are the theological understandings. These are the conversations when you're working with spiritual leaders. This is why it's frustrating to talk to them, because you're talking in science and they're talking spirituality. And it's just, unless you have the same understanding, it gets really frustrating. Okay, so now, how does that play out from academia to the everyday church world experience and how it's translated? So here's why it's so confusing. So when you get into the 20 to 25, so this is kind of the spectrum here. You see the line here, and then you kind of see the kind of the cutoff there. So mental health is a spectrum. And because of the pandemic, we now understand that this is not just a mental health thing, this is a mental health spectrum thing. Okay, so usually in this category, the 20 to 25%, this usually is the individual or the family who has a mental illness or a diagnosis, and they're usually receiving treatment. And the biblical narrative in this part here is that we live in a fallen world. So if we live in a fallen world, that's why we have disaster. That's why we have disease. That's the narrative that's given for understanding and finding some comfort that you have a diagnosis and you're living with. That's usually the narrative. However, when you get to, let me just say this before I go on. In this category, church leaders are more likely to refer out to a professional because they realize they are way over their head and they need a lot of partnership and a lot of help in these challenges. But when we get to this part of this, this is what's called the brokenness message. And in this area here, I've looked at gatekeeper research and back into 2012, looking at this, that when it gets to this category, it drops by 50%, the church leader willing to refer out, because this is where it's confusing, because no one's coming in saying, I'm developing anxiety, I'm developing depression, and I think it's a disorder. This language that they're using is, God is sanctifying me, God's doing something deep in me, God's doing some stuff with some unresolved sin. They get into the karma, which is Jesus completely eliminated that understanding within the church, biblical. The karma of this is all the sin coming back up, and now you have to deal with it. God is sanctifying you. God is doing something, and using these harsh languages and these harsh realities of I'm just broken, and I'm a broken mess that in need of grace. And this is how it's translated, and this is why it's so confusing. As I had one lady, she wanted me to help her sister and helping her family and all stuff, because her sister had the kind of the 20-25% symptom and the description, but she herself said, and she's a successful person. She's very successful and very influential. And she said, my life's a mess. My doctor just put me on antidepressants. And she just listed out all these different challenges that are the classic symptoms of high anxiety and depression, enough that her doctor put her on some medication, but she looked at me and said, but I'd never come to your website. That's for mental illness. I have an appointment at the church to work on some inner healing. That's the confusion. And we have to broaden. And so what church leaders are having to do is, as they're working on change in mental health, it's change management. It's not stigma breaking. Pastors are really good, church leaders are really good at changing the narrative story of mental health to show the human experience so that you can get help. So there's really a way to do this. I have looked at, there is mental health stigma research. It goes all the way back to the 1950s. I've looked at all that stuff, and I can tell you what works and what doesn't work. And I don't know why we're doing some of the things we're still doing, because there's a better way to do it in such a way that reaches people. We're just trying to help that within the church. Okay, so this is the challenge here within. This is why it's confusing in the church, because again, they don't have the language for this. So wherever the person, just a little bit of hope here in the middle, wherever the person is on the spectrum, whatever they can identify, whether they're on one side or the other or right in the middle, our message with Grace Alliance and how we do our material is that you're on a wholeness journey. This is not a brokenness journey. This is a wholeness journey. There is life, and it can really work for you, and it can really help in such a way that you can become more resilient with life, and you can actually see some symptom reduction. Are we going to get rid of your diagnosis? That's not my goal. But I tell you what, I know that 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 I know your life can be transformed. As one a family member said, yeah, my psychiatrist and who works at the hospital said, I've never seen anybody with schizophrenia healed. And I said, yeah, I have never either. But I will tell you what, I've seen people with schizophrenia actually transformed. Now, that's the story that we got to tell. And how do we do that? And we could do that real simply. So here are the ways that we can do this in the church. And so this is where we get into capacity building, understanding how do we develop self-sustaining systems within the church so that it takes the load off, the pastoral load, on the church leaders, and how do we really transform and reinvent the system. And a lot of these things we already have in place. It's just seeing them grow and take new nuance to see those things. So, and we need to have them in simple, real time, with proven results and accessible now. So this is what I call tap into healing. So let's go through what this looks like. Now, I am going to take questions, so please use that QR code on the Slido if you have questions, and so and we'll take those afterwards, because I really love the engagement and the questions, because a lot of the stuff I'm doing a broad brushstroke. I'm not going to get it. I can tell you more details if you have questions. Okay, so the first point of the T is a toolkit training. Now, I know that there is a little card here, and there's a resource that you can download, and it's one format of a toolkit training. However, when I look at toolkit training, because I work with churches, I work with some of the most influential churches and some of the most non-influential churches. I love the whole spectrum because you can get help. But when I look at church, how to do this toolkit training is really from these three factors. One is identify. How do we identify a mental health challenge? in 5 to 10 minutes, or if you only get an hour coffee meeting, how does a church leader, and not just the pastor, the senior pastor, but the lay leader who's leading the small group, within 5 to 10 minutes can identify this is a mental health challenge. I got to wait for you to do that because I do it all the time. It's really simple. And using aspects of how to understand this confusion. And so I've got a training for all that as well. Then there's how do we use stress-free screening, tools that we take the guesswork out. Because most people in the church, this is the thing, is that most people in the church, when you talk about trying to identify mental health, they get overwhelmed and intimidated. It's like, no, we don't need to we're not diagnosing anybody. We're just recognizing the stress level is so severe that they need some help. Because if you pull out a survey and say, hey, let's take a survey and see where you are on the depression level, anxiety, they'll walk out of that meeting and say, forget you, I'm not doing that. I'm out of here. But if you say, hey, let me pull out this survey and let's measure where stress is. And where your stress is, then we can look at what resources we can get to help this process. It's understanding where people are and what the language that they use and what they'll respond to. And then also evidence-based ways to minister. I know all the research, and I'm not going to go into how usually when people go to the church, the research will show that usually they make it worse, and an average meeting will last up to 3 times before they actually leave the church. I know all that stuff. I had my fair share of tons of damage control when they go to the pastor and then they end up hospitalized, and then I kind of get in there and try to help do. I had a meeting with an individual, and he just got out of a 2-hour deep counseling, biblical counseling, and he was distraught. And it took 30 minutes, just damage control, just to get him back into a place of comfort and safety and understand he's okay. But what the minister doesn't understand is this person has OCD and doesn't understand you can't just pray that or biblicalize that away. How do you take the scripture into that journey rather than try to force out that stuff? Respect the whole person. So in this process, how do you minister? And what I noticed in a lot of trainings is and pastors will tell me, and church leaders tell me, I want ways to minister to people with mental health challenges in such a way that it helps them. Because we talk about active listening and we talk about communication skills, but there are actual ways that you can minister to people. And I'll tell you, I have tons of stories where I use these principles all the time, and within minutes, I can see symptoms dissipate. Minutes. And I'm not praying for them. I'm not trying to do some hooky, whatever, all that stuff. I'm just relating with them. And then you can see the symptoms dissipate. And I've got some great stories with that too. But what are the evidence-based tools? How do we integrate science, psychology, and neuroscience? If you understand these things, then you know how to minister. And then the scriptures are full of delightful things to help people in that distress and help them get to a safe place. All right, so then the second part of this is the A, is that we have to access our Avengers. And you know who our Avengers are? All of you. All you superheroes have been trained, have doctorates, who have licenses and certificates and all of these things to really help people. And we need to see that greater partnership within professionals. When I do the training, I don't tell church leaders, come up with your referral list so that you know how to get you. I don't know why that comes out like Kermit's voice, but the letter O. But the thing is people. You refer to relationships. You don't refer to institution. People will refer. So, hey, I have a professional. We know them. I think they can really help you. And they're more likely to go and receive that help. Okay? But the access to the professionals is first, obviously, the therapists and the coaches. Then there's the doctors and psychiatrists. And make creative access to these professionals. When we were running our mental health recovery coaching program, our practice, we had set up a clever, creative way with a doctor who was an owner in one of these urgent care clinics, and he said, hey, for a small fee, for about $100, we'll do a quick evaluation, we'll help the individual, and maybe even if the doctor feels, they could start them on a medication rather than waiting 8 weeks before they can see a psychiatrist. And we're talking about a medication that's on a low end, maybe hydroxyzine or something like that, just to at least help that person in the process, but at least get that evaluation process started and help for those individuals. That's creative, working with all the channels that you have because the system is overloaded. Okay, and then obviously legal and law partners. I was filling out parole papers. People in our groups we were signing off for their parole things. I testified in court for an individual, and the judge. This was particularly a very challenging judge. The attorney told me, but we testified in court for this individual, and the judge said, as long as this person is in this program, we're good. That's because there was no jail diversion program set up where we are. But it was just these ways of partnering with the integration of what's upstream to downstream and pulling them together so that we have a steady stream all the way from professionals to integration in the church. Okay, and then people with people. We have got to have community. Dr. William Anthony, he did research on mental illness back in the 1990s, and he was doing research on mental illness recovery, and what he found, and he has this document, it's like the 10 principles of mental illness recovery, what we see. So, of course, I was curious, I read it, and he says that the common denominator in all mental illness recovery was community. You didn't find a case without it. Community is the hugest piece of this, and we know this because community heals meaning and purpose. And you put people back in that place of community. The isolation, as we know, it's worse for you than smoking. We know that, okay? That's what the research and studies show. But when we put people back in community, we're giving them a sense of meaning, we're giving them a sense of purpose, and we're growing together. So in the way now I've looked at what's an effective support group and what's not an effective support group. So here are some principles that how we've designed our material and some of these other materials that I'll show you have also designed. First is that there's a shared lived experience. When you try to have somebody with a mental health challenge and you put them into a Bible study group that they have no ability to relate, that person is going to feel tension and usually will leave that group. But when you put people in shared lived experience, what happens is you get that radical acceptance and you get that validation of experience. Your experience is real. Validation and that acceptance is part of the process. When you look at resilience and those studies and things like that there's an aspect of acceptance. They accept this. They can't control it, but they can accept it and know how to move on from that. Okay, so shared experience is really important. And then there's a shared faith. And because faith is an accelerator of mental health. When you look at, again, I look at studies on how does faith impact the individual, and you'll see that there are physiological changes actually in the brain with the person with the faith concept, and as well as mental and emotional. And here's the reason why faith is really important, because sometimes when somebody, and I hear this all the time, but when somebody is in a mental health journey, and they're in a community support group, but their value is Christ-centered or church or a faith aspect, but when they're having to leave faith at the door for the sake of the inclusivity of everybody, they're missing a piece of value. And if you understand the research and the studies on value and identity, that is huge to the person. So when you reinforce that faith value, you're reinforcing identity of that whole person's experience and what's really important to them for their growth journey. So it's validating and valuing that faith and having that faith concept explained in such a way that it's easy to grow in rather than it's hard to attain. Okay? And then discovery learning and experiential learning as well. So in our groups, that's what we do. We help them discover. It's kind of a Socratic or heuristic, learning how to process these things so that they can discover. If you guys have looked at some of the models on discovery learning and things like this, they do obviously overseas, Finland, Sweden. I think they have really progressive models and showing some really neat things there. But discovery learning from scripture to science and these tools. And that's why we throw in experiential tools that are evidence-based, learning how, so we talk about, like one chapter, we talk about medication. What does the Bible say about medication? Is it a faith issue? So we show them some biblical literature showing God is okay with this. So if you're comfortable, if you're current, or if you're not comfortable, that's okay. But we show you how it works and what to look for in that process so you don't get thrown into a confusion of a minefield of medications, but understand how to work that strategically. Tools that help them navigate their journey that are important to them in different aspects. Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 different resources, and one of them is ours, but what I see as far as that are some of the best in the nation and that are having international reach and influence. So the first is trauma and PTSD. This is Reboot Recovery. This is and I know these guys, so I've had conversations with them, and they primarily work with first responders and veterans and things like that. They do have a general population, but typically their mainstay as far as their focus, what they do really is veterans and first responders. Again, because of the secondary trauma and obviously the post-traumatic aspects of war and different things. And they have about 500 to 700 groups internationally, most of those in the U.S., but their in-house studies show that they have over a 90% satisfaction rate through that, and that they see up to 20% improvement on overall well-being and symptoms. It's pretty impressive. And this is happening in churches everywhere. The second one is mental illness. It's really kind of the mental illness, mental health, and trauma is Fresh Hope. And they run their groups much like a Celebrate Recovery, if you guys are familiar, where they have principles, biblical principles related to the mental health aspects and things like that. And they have conversations around those as well. And they have about 90 groups, and they have a 90% effective rate as far as they find their participants are more compliant. They are compliant to treatment, and then they find them more helpful than previous groups, referring to community groups because of the faith concept. Not that the community groups are lacking, it's just because of the faith concept is there. And then this is a little infomercial here, but this is our Grace Alliance. We basically run groups. They are topical groups. We have them for families. We have them for individuals, and so that and we help through that. It's topical, and then we have we're kind of getting close to 800 groups internationally. We've translated Spanish. We're working in Hong Kong, Chinese, all these things. We see about 20 to 30 groups every quarter. So this last quarter, we saw another almost 40 groups start. So because the need is there, everybody's jumping on it, and the churches are really looking at. Again, we have 4 published studies showing that the symptom reduction, they aid in mental health recovery. We see faith renewal, and as well, we see that our training model shows confidence in ministers and things like that. Now, I'm showing this picture here because I want to show you that. Here, let me back up here just. Okay, all right. So I wanted to talk about one of the researches that we did, because it's kind of like if you can drive a school bus, a stick shift school bus, you can drive anything, right? So we took our program into Benghazi, Libya. This was during the crisis in Libya. The government fell apart, all these things. And the biggest need was mental health. They had their psychological first aid where they do debriefing, especially within their refugees. So again, long story short, we teamed up with other organizations. We work with the UNICEF, UN, all different organizations on the ground in the refugee camps, the IDP, interdisplaced peoples, the refugee camps. And what we did is we took our Living Grace model for mental health. We just adapted it for trauma recovery, and then we launched in these groups. So, and my deal was, if this gets complicated, I'm leaving Grace Alliance. This has to be simple every day, and we can apply it right now. So this is me. I went 2 or 3 times. I trained in the Benghazi Medical Center. I trained in the camps. I trained with other leaders and showed them how to do this. I just have a piece of paper. This is and a translator, and we trained within the refugee camps for these individuals. And so what we saw, and this is the research that came out of this, is that at the beginning of the groups, 58% of the participants met clinical criteria for PTSD. That means they had 7 or more symptoms. But by the end of 10 weeks, that number dropped down to 0. That means they had 10 or less. These individuals had been in these camps already for months. They didn't have access to psychiatry, medications, therapy, anything other than just this group. And after these 10-week period, we saw these things. These results, showing that these principles can work on a simple and everyday level within the church. So the deal is what if your church could see this type of healing in your community and within 10 weeks? And what state would that person be in by the time they actually got into therapy and more care if you had an easy way to do this? One last story here is there actually a church in Irving that they run our groups, and a family came in. They met with the pastor and the elders for prayer, and they happened to be meeting on a Monday night, the same night that they run our groups. The pastor and the elders met with the family for about 40 minutes. They prayed and realized that this family was dealing with a mental health challenge in their family and a lot of difficulties. As soon as the meeting is over, the senior pastor takes the family, walks them all the way across the campus, introduces them into the group, says, this is a group you need to be in. And then the family begins to weep because they said, we didn't even know that this existed in the church. And they're thriving and getting more tools and better help. That's the story we can tell in the church because we have results in showing that we can have innovative and transformative change within the church. So we are in a new era. And so what I do is I have, if you want more information, I have free virtual meetings. I meet with church leaders all around the world. I have met with groups in Africa, Kenya. They're ready to launch things and doing a whole network with their churches, working in Hong Kong, England. And what's happening across the world is pastoral care is being reinvented, and it's including mental health. And the church is looking for solutions. This is a great time to see better help and better numbers for people's lives. Thank you. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, now you can see how old I am. How should the church, so there was a question, how should the church best respond to those who say they've experienced religious trauma or isolation, especially minorities or LGBTQ plus people?
So how should the church respond to LGBT, desperate, or where they've experienced church hurt, things like that? The most important thing, and again, you psychologists will know this, the most important thing for an individual who's coming out of a background where there has been damage or they're not feeling accepted is to first help them feel that they're safe and that they're in a controlled environment with that safety. So you're reaffirming that in this church, we're not going to judge you or keep looking at your sin. We're going to be looking at your challenge and how we can help with your challenge. And we'll work out all those things along the way. We're not going to tell you to be a certain way or what you can't be. We're just going to show you how you can improve. So, and again, it's just that the church doesn't have to have all the answers for everything. It's just that we're in a process to grow together and being willing to learn and grow together within that. So it takes a lot of humility for the church leaders to admit and say that and work with that process. Because I've had clients come to me and they say, I'm here because I've heard this is pretty good, but I don't want anything to do with this whole Jesus thing or all this faith stuff. That's a bunch of crap to me, blah, 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 blah. So, but let's go for it. I'm like, okay, great. You don't have to have Jesus. That's fine. I'll help you. 3 weeks later, he's like, hey, you know what? I started to pray a little bit. It's like, because I don't force it. They need to feel invited into that journey so that they can experience and explore it. So again, discovery, learning, and experiential.
So what is a small first step a layman in a church could do to help in the future of mental health ministry in their church? So if you're a layman, what's a first step?
As a layman, I think it's really looking at working with your church and understanding how to get better education and how to get better training for the process. So it depends on what the layman's looking for. If they're looking for how do we do this for myself, or if that layman is an advocate in mental health, then again, it's looking at programs like ours and things like that. So oftentimes when I work with church leaders, I tell them that you don't have to do all the education, training, all that stuff. Just recruit and employ the people who are already on this journey because you'll learn a lot from them and they're ready to go. Our training process is free and you can start tomorrow. You can watch 45 minutes worth of videos, just order a workbook, that's the only cost. And then you can start the process because these families and these individuals have so much lived experience and knowledge through that journey, they're ready to help other people. And I actually, some of our groups, that the groups that they've set up, they've turned into big ministries, and they actually work as the education for the church. So so sometimes you can work backwards, where it doesn't have to be top down; it could be bottom up, and you'll see that great integration together.
Okay, then we have time for one last question. I'm part of a congregation with leadership resistant to addressing the science of mental health. How do I introduce the idea that they be open to exploring it?
Yes, great question. I see this all the time. When you meet with church leaders, the thing is with the church leader is, remember, they in seminary, they don't get this kind of training at all. They don't get, if they do, it's an extracurricular. We've done some research on that. You just tell stories. You just relate the story, because when you tell the story, it will help you understand the statistics. If you come in with the numbers, the research shows numbers do not change anybody. Stories do, because you're empathizing, and our brains connect with a story, and so then we'll have greater empathy, and then the story will cause the next question, well, what can we do? So that's why I always encourage, keep a conversation and keep a story going with your church leader. Just don't push them, because they don't like to be. I have one guy's like, I keep talking to my pastor, he keeps saying no, and I'm gonna email him and I'm telling him, get off the pot and do something. And I was like, no, just work with the conversation and work with where they are, and then, but you could still start something in your community. All you need is one other person to start a group. Just start helping other people. And then usually the church gets curious, and they're like, hey, could we talk more? So, and again, we don't have to think big. We just start, how can we start a small little match and let that turn into a little bit of a fire, and then let that grow on its own.
Thank you so much. So give him a round of applause.